Hi from Chicago. This Big Ten Today, presented by Gatorade. Thrilled to have you with us. Mike Hall alongside Anthony Herron. And Anthony, if there's one thing I love about you, it's your consistency. You are always here.
Okay.
I always see you. The background is always the same. It never changes. It's consistent.
Yeah, as opposed to, is there someone else who you might be comparing that with?
We bring in Ross Dellinger, who once again is not in his home base. Where are you now, Ross?
All right.
A little place called the University of Notre Dame. So visiting the Fighting Irish here in South Bend. Not far from you guys.
Not far, but still.
Potential thorn in the Big Ten side.
Potentially.
Yeah, right.
We may have to get into that.
I was hoping to avoid that conversation, Anthony, but yes.
Well, we will find out soon. In fact, we'll find out the latest rankings coming out from the committee in a matter of moments. It is where we start off our show, and it is the big story. The second reveal of the season is coming soon. Here's a look at last week's rankings and the results that came in from the weekend games, and look at 3 and 4. If you hadn't noticed, both of those teams lost. They will be falling, and that will have an impact on multiple Big Ten teams this evening. Anthony, I'm going to go to you first.
Okay.
Indiana and Penn State rose in the recent AP rankings. Will they rise in the upcoming playoff rankings?
I mean, they better. They're both coming off of wins. They both looked impressive when you think about how they functioned last week. And the total body of work for all these things matters quite a bit, of course. And the quality of opponents that you're losing to is a factor there as well. I was mentioning Notre Dame potentially being a thorn at everyone's side. Georgia Tech has proven to be a thorn in the side of Miami. But, are you losing to a decent team? Are you losing to a great team? Are you potentially going down to a team who is amazing, amongst the best in America? And that's where you're looking at the resume for Ohio State, the resume for Penn State, and the unblemished resume for Indiana right now. Yes, there will continue to be Big Ten teams that are boosted, that are pushed forward because of the way they've been able to sustain. There's this separation now in the conference with that top quadrant. And by comparison to the other squads, I don't think, Ross, that it's necessarily a knock on the SEC or a knock on where the ACC is at with things, because, yeah, there's going to be difficult games that get played. But in my opinion, Ross, it's just what makes sense. We're going to see these teams continue to be pushed forward.
We are, and I don't think there's any doubt that Indiana and Penn State will move up at least a couple spots, maybe even 3 spots or so. But when you look at the losses from Georgia and Miami, obviously ranked ahead of them, they will drop back or should drop back in the Indiana and Penn States should move forward. And I know about Indiana's schedule. In fact, before I was here at Notre Dame just yesterday, I was at Indiana. It's too bad we weren't taping yesterday. I was then in Bloomington, so I got to meet with Coach Sig in the Hoosiers, and they know too about the schedule, right? Everybody knows about their schedule, but it's really not going to matter in the end if they can find a way to win all their games or maybe win all but one of their games, right? There's a pretty big game coming up for Indiana in a week and a half at Ohio State. And Anthony, it's not important necessarily to be required to win that game, but I think how you play in that game, given your schedule strength, will be really, really important. Because when you have an 11-1 Indiana team, comparing that with several, could be as many as like 4 or 5 2-loss SEC teams, that's going to be the comparison, probably the separator there is, how did Indiana lose? How was that game against Ohio State? So it's a huge, huge game in a week and a half for the Hoosiers and Coach Cignetti.
And Ross, and Mike and I have had a chance to kind of talk back and forth about versions of this a decent bit the last couple of years, because I do like that there is nuance to this conversation, where just having 0 in the loss column or having 1 in the loss column by comparison to other teams, I don't believe it's right to solely base it off of that. But traditionally, that's kind of how it went in the past. And it seems to me that where we're at right now, seeing the first college football playoff rankings come out, I don't know, there's humans in the room, so who knows for sure, but my impression based off of that was that expanding beyond the 4-team playoff did allow the committee a bit more freedom to say that, you know what, we don't necessarily base it just off the 0. BYU still had the 0 rolling at that point. Army still had the 0, and they didn't boost them into, or even very close to, in some cases, that top 4 range, just like Indiana. But there's still a proving ground that's available here. And so I do think that having having the 12-team playoff, it feels like it's less pressure on the committee right now to say that just because your record indicates this, that they can have some nuance, and that's where things like strength of record, strength of schedule, I don't think the football power index should matter that much, but game control, things that do favor the Indiana Hoosiers. So even in the midst of their bye, some of those other metrics I think will be a part of it. And then, of course, the eyeball test is what's super subjective. So it's hard to say how they'll view the Hoosiers in that regard.
Well, and to your point earlier, common sense and rationality would say we're splitting hairs between an 8 and a 9, right? If it's, okay, you get to host a game and not, okay, that's much different than 4-5 being left out. The same thing if you're the 13th team being left out. Like, there's still going to be outrage when it happens, I guarantee you. But I think when you're rational, you realize, okay, that's a lot different than the 5th team being left, like a Florida State undefeated being left out of a playoff than if you're whatever the 13th team is going to be, right?
Right. And I mean, last year, not only Florida State left out, 2-time defending national champion, Georgia left out last season as well. And so, I mean, that ends up mattering when you're thinking about the way that we are subjectively comparing opponents. And that's where, the other conference is going to have a bunch of teams in right now. The Big Ten is in amazing shape to have a bunch of teams in. The Southeastern Conference, of course, is as well. But there has been more carnage in the SEC. And so to me, Ross, not only, kind of giving you a hard time about Notre Dame maybe being a thorn in the side of the Big Ten, but how the SEC and whether or not it's a 2-loss SEC champion or perhaps even a 3-loss team that makes the championship game, that seems to me, Ross, to be one of those things that could impact the way that a team like Indiana, maybe a team like Penn State gets viewed in the overall seeding structure.
Right. The committee has said, and I think the executive director, Rich Clark, has said that teams won't necessarily be penalized for, advancing to their championship game in losing. So it's something to keep in mind going forward with specifically the SEC and Big Ten runner-up, those teams that advance to the championship game and then lose. The committees, maybe they'll count it as like a half loss in their mind. So they won't. They seem to be they're going to give some leeway there for those teams that advance. So you could have, a 10-3 SEC championship game loser, right, be competing with a team like 11-1 Indiana, right? We could see that, and you have to side by side compare these resumes, strength of schedule, the losses, how they came, right? Top 25 wins. Those are kind of I think the 3 probably biggest metrics. And then overall, the eyeball test, right? We hear it all the time. How do you look, right? And we've seen Indiana look really good, right? Even though it's a weaker schedule, we've seen them look really good. And it's why how they look in Columbus in a week and a half will set them up for this resume comparison that we'll almost certainly see, whether it's Ohio State or Indiana, the loser of that game, we'll see them have this resume comparison with some of these SEC teams and even a Big 12 and ACC runner-up in their championship game potentially as well.
Yeah, I mean, from the Indiana fans I've talked to, they're already worried about
make your blood boil a little bit.
Or 3-loss SEC team getting in over them because they're Indiana and somebody else is a traditional power program. But I think in that Ohio State game, obviously the goal is to win. But if it was to be a close game, I mean, it's not like this week against Michigan was their first close game. All their other games, they're winning by multiple scores. So, again, if you were watching these Indiana games, which we believe the committee has been doing, theoretically.
Don't go all Donardo on me. I think they're watching the games.
I believe they, at least now. Maybe they didn't watch in September, Indiana football, but they're watching now, and that should theoretically come into play, that it's not just what you did in November, but all the way you played against the teams, no matter how good or bad they were. I do want to switch to a specific team. We talked a little bit of Indiana there. Indiana, you could argue, is going to be rooting for some of the teams they beat to be winning, but Penn State, I feel, is in an interesting spot, Anthony, to do something similar because they needed a bounce-back win this weekend. They got it. But if Illinois, Wisconsin, USC, and Minnesota, assuming Penn State beats them, can keep winning the rest of their games, all of a sudden that Penn State one-loss, which, again, came by only one score to a top 5 ranked Ohio State team, that looks really good because there's a chance Penn State's, in fact, they're probably in the most likely spot to be left out of a Big Ten title game. So they wouldn't get that extra opportunity. So they'd be a one-loss team, not even in a championship game. But if those other teams start winning, beating Illinois when they're 6-3 maybe doesn't look great, but if they're 9-3, it looks a lot better.
Right, and for Penn State's resume, that's where comparing the game they played against Ohio State, that matters. Some of the road environments and the difficulty of some of these road environments that the Nittany Lions have been able to go to and come up with victories, on the road. And West Virginia isn't an amazing team, but you go there and you win that game opening the season up, that matters. The difficulty of the multi-time zone games, going out to USC, winning that game, it does matter. So the perception of what they've done throughout the season, both at home and on the road, and then, of course, that narrow defeat against Ohio State. It's a great feather in the cap for the Buckeyes and keeps them squarely in the playoff picture. But also from a loss perspective, it's one of the best losses in the country, perhaps the only loss that's better for any of these teams who are in the top handful of teams in the country is Ohio State losing to the current number 1 team in the country in the Oregon Ducks. So Penn State has a resume, and that's where for Indiana to be able to do that, go and play the Buckeyes and look like one of those teams that can go toe-to-toe with the Buckeyes will certainly factor in. I think both for Penn State and Indiana, you also have the potential for all these bowl-eligible teams, to your point, who by the end of the season, if you have, 5, 6 teams that you've defeated that have at least a bowl-eligible record, if not a winning record by the end of this thing, then yeah, maybe some of the overall metrics, there may be a few teams that have an advantage in game control, strength of record, but to have that many squads who are at least bowl eligible, I think that adds up and should matter as well.
By the way, I understand if you're an Oregon fan, you're probably going, boy, we're number 1 in the country. We didn't get talked about.
Yeah.
Nothing's happening in Oregon.
Yeah, right.
They're going to stay number 1.
You guys are amazing.
They won by multiple touchdowns this
fine.
weekend. It's going to be fine. The Ducks will still be number 1 when the playoff rankings come out in just a handful of hours. All right, here's a look at the big board. A little less big than some weeks we've seen. 4 teams are off, so
beefy, still sizable.
Exactly.
A formidable board.
14 teams are in action, and it does even begin on Friday. And I want to start off with that Friday game with UCLA and Washington. Our theme here is about teams that are a win away from bowl eligibility, and you will see a team on display in Friday's matchups. UCLA plays Washington on Friday. It's a 4-win UCLA, a 5-win Washington team. But Ross, that 4-win UCLA team has figured some things out. They're on a bit of a run right now.
They are. Deshaun Foster's first season and got started not well, right, and then boom, they've gone on a crazy run. 3 straight wins: Rutgers, Nebraska, and one that I don't know that anybody saw coming, beating Iowa last weekend. A really impressive win over the Hawkeyes. It seems like Deshaun Foster and group have figured something out. It's quite a mid-season turnaround that we're seeing there from UCLA and from the Bruins there. I go back to media days in July with Deshaun Foster, where he reminded all of us where UCLA is located in Los Angeles. And I remember everybody thinking, oh man, is this guy ready for a big job, right? And boom, he has turned it around mid-season. Pretty incredible what we've seen there. And then on the other side, right, Jed Fish, Anthony, I think he returned 2 starters to the team that advanced to the national championship game, and they're a win from bowl eligibility. I would have think a lot of people in Washington would have said if you can get to 7 wins, pretty successful year. So they're close.
Context, Ross, to your point, matters so much, I think, with each of these 2 programs because, we saw Deshaun Foster be a part of what Chip Kelly was starting to do in rebuilding and rebranding UCLA football into a consistent winner. And then Chip Kelly leaves at the last moment after Foster has left to go to the National Football League. And now he's thrust onto this big stage with the big whistle for the first time at his alma mater. And media days didn't go well. Addressing things, sort of macro topics with the media, not necessarily his comfort zone. But what we have seen throughout his time as an assistant coach, the way he's developed his talent. The guys in that running back room in Westwood over the years who worked for, played for, worked with, been trained by Deshaun Foster, they get better and better week by week, month by month, season by season, and that is precisely what we're seeing UCLA football doing. And so at this point where if you thought about this game a month or so ago, the way Washington was beginning to play, the way UCLA was still in the midst of what seemed like struggles at that point, you thought, okay, that's a game that's definitely going to go the way of the Dogs. Not the fact right now, not the way this is actually going. The home road splits, though, for the Huskies have been really good for them being back at home. So I think that spells positive things for the Huskies, but all the talent that didn't return and the way both these first-year coaches with their programs are being measured, kind of like the scales are being tipped and thrown out because of what Kurt Signetti is doing in Bloomington.
Right.
But this is normally what a first year with the program looks like. That sort of steady, methodical development.
Right. And if you're Washington, yes, you played in the national championship game last year, but you lost everybody on the roster. So if Jed Fish can win this game against UCLA, get them to 6 victories, be bowl eligible, that is a nice step forward for them. Now, Nebraska is another team, Ross, that has 5 wins, and they'll take on USC. The problem is they've been sitting on 5 wins since the first week of October. Off, then 3 losses.
It felt like they've been sitting on 5 wins for a couple of years now. I think
they've been on 5 wins for a decade. That's what it feels like. Yeah. It absolutely. They can't get over that hump, guys. It seems like. I think it's like 3 or 4 times really in the last 7 years they've been so close to that bowl eligibility. So they're on this. I think it's a 7-game slide since 2016 without a bowl, and they don't handle those things well. In Huskerville, and it looked like they were going to get that right. That 6th win, as you mentioned, Mike, 5-1 now for a month in 3 straight losses. So second year with Matt Rule, it felt like, and all if you look back on Matt Rule's tenures at other places, he's had big year 2s, and this felt like the defense was back. Dylan Raiola, there was just all this hype, and it felt like not only would Matt Rule and Nebraska make a bowl game, but I mean, we were talking about them for college football playoff type of candidacy. I thought maybe they would get to that 9-10 win mark potentially, and here they are at 5-4, needing a win really badly here, and it's just been this rough stretch, and we saw them make an offensive coordinator change, Anthony. Nebraska hadn't scored 20 points in a game since September 28th. In 6 weeks since they've scored at least 20 points in a football game. They make the offensive coordinator change. Dana Holgorsen comes in, former West Virginia coach, Houston coach, was with TCU as an analyst, and then joined Nebraska just a week or 2 ago, and then boom, he's now offensive coordinator and going to be calling the plays. So an interesting wrinkle there to watch in this game against the Trojans.
And I think, Ross, one of the words that Matt Rule has used over the last couple of days to describe the decision to, have Marcus Satterfield still remain on staff, coach the tight ends, but Dana Holgorsen come in. And I mean, you're talking about just getting to know these players over the course of about the past week and a half, essentially. A bold move is one word that Matt Rule used to describe how this could end up being viewed. And, I think that having the helmet communication this season is one of those things that I'm curious how that will end up impacting this, because the positive aspect of that, as Holgorsen has his verbiage that he's kind of learning and bringing to things, and then what the pre-existing verbiage was, now you have a young quarterback, whether it ends up being, because we don't know for sure if it'll be Dylan Raiola, will it be Heinrich Harburg? It's hard to say for sure, but Nebraska's on the cusp of reaching a milestone that their program hasn't reached in so long, that having him come in, it is a bold move, but how this ends up impacting the offense in the midst of a season will be key.
Again, start 5-1, have an off week, lose 3 games, have another off week, but 3 more games still to come for them, and that first one comes this week against USC. Speaking of USC, we are going to reflect on the life of John Robinson, who passed away yesterday, a USC coaching legend. One of his former players is going to join us on the show right after this. Late yesterday, we got the news that a USC great passed away. Longtime Trojan football coach John Robinson died at the age of 89. He coached the Trojans in 2 different stints, from 76 to 82, then again from 93 to 97. In between, he was a very successful head coach in the NFL for the Rams, making 2 NFC title games. But he was most known for his time with the Cardinal and Gold. Overall, he won 74% of his Trojan games, which included the 1978 national title and 8 bowl games, 4 Rose Bowl victories. He coached multiple Heisman Trophy winners and made it into the College Football Hall of Fame in 2009. For more perspective on this, we bring in Petros Papadakis, the former tailback at USC. Petros, put into words what John Robinson meant to USC.
Oh, I think that he was kind of a catalyst after John McKay for more greatness on the field and championships and Rose Bowls. And He was a great offensive innovator in the run game, all that shift stuff with the tight end and the halfback that Joe Gibbs and the Washington Redskins did for all those years. He really was a big part of that. But overall, I think that he was a great communicator. And overall, I think people loved to play for him because of his ability to lead and his humor and his passion for the game. And he used to wear his gold chain out, in meetings and things like that. He dressed colorfully and was just an overall inspirational figure for that time in USC football. And I played for him when he came back the second time and won a Rose Bowl against Northwestern on that great Gary Barnett team, if you remember that. So
yeah,
he meant a lot for many years.
Let's continue where you were going with the gold chains and his humor, his personality. It's what people talk about so much with him. What was it like just being in a room and having a chat with him?
I remember my first meeting at USC, and I just couldn't believe the chaos. The guys are screaming and yelling at each other, and there were like little scuffles breaking out. It was amazing just to see the energy in the room. And he walked in with his Sansa belts on, tucked way up, and his chains and his sandals. He wore like the Jesus sandals, and just everybody shut up. A hush would come, and he'd walk around for like 20 seconds before even saying a word, and then he'd stop and do his jowly thing. And it was always fun and always interesting to be on his team because you never knew how he was going to handle something or what story he was going to tell about Ronnie Lott or Marcus Allen or the Trojans of the past. So it was always an inspirational thing, and you always wanted to please him, and that's really what a great coach does. You don't want to play well because you're scared of him. You want to play well because you want to make that guy happy and proud.
You mentioned your first meeting with the Trojans. What was the very first time you met him in any environment?
Oh, well, I met him when I was a child. My father was a USC football player at all Pac-8 or Pac-4 or whatever it was back then. And my father used to host a restaurant there. You see at my dad's restaurant, the Papadakis Tavern, that was open for about 40 years. And that's my older brother in the background, Tasso Papadakis, who actually was one of J-Rob's first commits to USC the second time around when he came back to coach again. So we'd have the whole team, Rodney Peete, Todd Marinovich, all of those, Tim Ryan, all those guys you can think of. When I was a kid, and we would host at my dad's restaurant and I would work. So I got to know him long before I played football for him. And that's always interesting because, when you're a kid and you see football players, when you're a kid and you watch high school football, it's pretty hard to convince yourself that there's ever been a better football player than that guy you're watching, 17 years old. So when you're a kid, it's very surreal to be around football players and coaches of that caliber. So I got to know him a long time before I played for him, and was never disappointed being in the room with him. Always found inspiration.
What did he think of your game?
He didn't think I was, when they recruited me, he offered me a scholarship to play defense because he said, you're not cut-like, you're not cut-like enough. So I ended up signing at Cal to play running back and humiliating myself there and then transferring to USC and did well enough at running back at Cal, I guess, to earn a right to compete for the position at USC. So, but yeah, he did not think I was cat-like enough, too stilted of a runner, which was absolutely true. But I think he liked the way I competed. He let me break the wedge and be the wedge breaker and sacrifice my head to turn into a canoe for the Trojans year in and year out. So that was always fun.
Well, in his defense, he brought in horses for his running games. He was used to incredible tailbacks. You mentioned Marcus Allen. Even when he was in the NFL, right, he had Eric Dickerson with the Rams.
Oh, yeah. Look, he was a great, and Greg Bell with the Rams and Charles White who was a USC Heisman Trophy winner, who passed a little while ago, maybe a couple years back. Charles White was the leading rusher in the NFL for the LA Rams during the strike season. And when he had the Rams, they were great. Henry Ellard, Jim Everett, you mentioned Eric Dickerson, Flipper Anderson. I mean, those were really special teams, but they just couldn't get over the hump and beat Ronnie Lott and the 49ers and Joe Montana every year. They lose in the NFC Championship game. But, he understood the run game. And we would have 40, 45 play, 9-on-7 run drills, which, would be considered draconian torture in today's football practice world. He was used to a lot better backs than me. Let's just put it that way. And I had to climb my way up the depth chart. And I didn't really end up carrying the ball significantly at USC until Paul Hackett was the head coach.
Robinson really was a very good NFL head coach as well. You mentioned the NFC title games. He took the Rams there multiple times. But when we all think of him, we think of him as USC. Why is that?
I think because of the early 80s and Charles White and Marcus Allen and the championships and John McKay. I think the LA Rams are a thing in LA, but not as much of a thing even back then as you can imagine. And what he did with Keyshawn and beating that Northwestern team, that was big news in those days. And the way he was fired on a cell phone or on an answering machine from Mike Garrett, and he couldn't even do his press conference from USC, ended up doing it from a hotel. So a lot of the drama, I think, at USC, and Jim Rome, who was very popular in those days, talked a lot about him and went back and forth about the team. So I think that's probably a big part of it. And I think USC culture, when J-Rob was the coach, kind of felt like Camelot a little bit. It was sort of the days before big regulations and stuff in college football. And USC's always, they hung on to the model where they had one of their athletic directors as an ex-jock for years and years. So it's always been kind of a strange place in that way. Lynn Swann, Pat Hayden, John Robinson was the athletic director for a few years at UNLV. And if it wasn't for what Barry Odom is doing right now at UNLV, which is remarkable, John Robinson would go down as one of their greatest coaches ever, and he was their athletic director for a couple of years as well. So a real polymath of our sport, and he will be missed. He was beloved by all his players and all the people around him, really.
Petros Papadakis, thank you so much for your time and the perspective on a USC legend. We appreciate it.
Fight on. Thank you. And what a time to be in the Big Ten for the Trojans.
Well. The NCAA tournament is out for women's soccer, and the Big Ten is all over the place. Look at all these soccer matches coming your way Friday, Saturday, and Sunday involving Big Ten teams. If you can't do the math, I will. That's 10!
You can do that math?
Big Ten,
wow.
Who are dancing. And with that, we bring in Kylan Mills to talk all about it. Okay, a record for the conference. 10 teams in the tournament. What does that say to you?
It says to me that the Big Ten Conference is stronger than ever, but what a lot of people don't understand is we realistically, with the addition of these 4 West Coast schools, could see upwards of 12 or 13 teams making it in, Mike. Last year, the Big Ten set a record with 9 out of 14 schools making it to the NCAA tournament. This year, we're at 10 because a couple of the OG schools didn't make it. For example, Nebraska made an Elite 8 run a year ago. This year, a little bit of a down year. Naturally, things like that happen. They graduated the top scorer in the country from 2023. But programs like that come back up, and you're talking about 12, 13 teams realistically from the Big Ten Conference could be competitive in the NCAA tournament. I'm calling it. Next year, the year after, 12. Well, I'm dead serious. This is a powerhouse of a conference in women's soccer.
You took my next question, which was how much of it is just adding 4 more teams that you can get to that added number, but it sounds like
It's not. And that's the thing. I think a lot of people are seeing this on paper. I saw it a little bit on social media. Well, no kidding. They set a record. They added 4 schools. Of course, 10 schools make the NCAA tournament. But no, I think this number could absolutely be a little bit higher with a couple teams who are having down years by their program standards, making it back up and coming around. And then you add in powerhouses like USC and UCLA, Washington, a team very much on the comeuppance under head coach Nicole Van Dyke. You're talking about perennial NCAA tournament teams. I really believe this conference could be a 12-team NCAA tournament competitor every single season, or at least close to it.
You brought up USC. They're a 1 seed. What has to happen for them to be national champions?
Ooh, USC. So first I want to start out by saying, even though they did not win the Big Ten Tournament Championship, I have no concerns about the Trojans. What I want to point out about their semifinal matchup against Rutgers, where they fell in penalty kicks, is that the Scarlet Knights went down a player. Their leading scorer, or at least point getter, Riley Tiernan, went down with a red card. So they were only playing with 10 players. But that actually can be incredibly difficult to beat, because when you're playing down a man, what you do is you pack it in. You play in a low block, is what we call it in soccer, and you just put a bunch of numbers in front of the box and make it difficult to score on. That's exactly what USC was up against. I also actually think it's a positive for the Trojans to go in and lose in the Big Ten tournament versus the NCAA tournament, because they brought in the second longest win streak in the country to that matchup. They were unbeaten in 12 matches, which technically they are still, because they didn't lose that. It was a draw after overtime before it went to the penalty shootout. But if anything, that's the time to stumble. This USC team, they are incredible on both sides of the ball. They have a great defense. They have a couple of special players in their attack. Miley Hayes, an excellent attacker, 8 goals on the season, leading the way. Elena Sampaio, the Big Ten midfielder of the year, pulling the strings. They play a beautiful possession style of soccer. It is fun to watch. USC could very well be the national champions.
You mentioned USC did not win the Big Ten championship.
Correct.
Which brings us to UCLA. They are a 2. They look at the bracket and see Iowa as a 3 on their side of the bracket.
So I hate this about the draw, because Iowa and UCLA are 2 of my favorite teams going into the NCAA tournament. First, the Bruins. Mike, outstanding based on what I saw in the Big Ten tournament. This is a team that has gotten healthier. They've continued to progress as the season has gone on, and everything is clicking. Listen to this. Best defense in the country by goals against average and leading the country in shutouts. What has been the issue is they've struggled to score. However, in the Big Ten, they led the conference in shots. They were second in the conference in corner kicks taken. That means the offense has been coming. They've been creating chances. What head coach Marguerite Awazasa told me is it's just about being more clinical in and around the 18. You get a performance like 5 goals against Rutgers, sometimes when the floodgates open, then it all starts to flow. So if you combine the best defense in the country with a team that suddenly is finishing on the chances they've been creating all season long, the Bruins are unstoppable. I also love this Iowa team, though. They're incredibly gritty. I love head coach Dave Diani. He's done an excellent job of just making this a really difficult team to beat. They also are 7th in the country in terms of their goals against average. So you're talking about offense wins games, defense wins championships. The Hawkeyes are set up for success. And ready for my best story about head coach Dave Diani. He has been a head coach for 2 decades. He keeps every single former player's number and birthday in his phone, and he texts them on their birthday. This is an individual who is genuine. He is invested in the players, and I believe that they believe in him, and that propels them to postseason success.
So those are some of the teams who you think have a shot, just some, at winning it all. But what about those teams that barely got in? A bubble team like Washington just gets in, the last Big Ten team in. But in one-and-done postseason tournaments, just getting in is what matters. You can get hot at the right time, and who cares where you were placed in the bracket?
Absolutely, and you look at teams that are in the bottom. I say this with quotations, in the bottom of the Big Ten, because this conference is so strong. But you look at, for example, Penn State, a 10th seed in the Big Ten tournament, and they've been ranked in the top 25 all season long. This is a team loaded with talent. They have a head coach, Erica Dombach, who has led them to NCAA tournament after NCAA tournament. The Nittany Lions have made 30 straight, the longest active streak in the country. They're loaded with talent. So it's just incredible to see just how deep the Big Ten is come tournament time, because a number of teams who are 7, 8, 9 seeds in the Big Ten tournament are now seeded and hosting regionals in the NCAA tournament. So I just think you cannot count any Big Ten team out. You look at Ohio State, another team that had to play in the first round, a 7 to 10 seed, ranked in the top 25 all season long, has been competitive with NCAA tournament teams. Minnesota having an excellent season. You just go down the list, and I really do believe any Big Ten team has a chance to make a deep run.
Exciting time for the sport you love. First
so next
round action.
segment, we're going to do a demo, right? So
yes.
You're going to kick a ball around?
Yes. Because
You
this
heard it
is
here.
Comedy Central. Action begins on Friday for the Big Ten. Kylan Mills, always fun.
It is fun. It'll be more fun when I see you doing some juggling here on set.
Well, it'll be like this, though. It won't be with the soccer
Okay,
ball. I mean, that's the thing. That's what stands out so much about Indiana right now. It is their defense, their efficiency, their numbers, everything. There have been years where Indiana's offense has been good. They haven't been able to pack it together, but that defense is so impressive. And it got Anthony thinking about this week's Impact 5. He's going to count down the top 5 defensive linemen in the Big Ten right now. At number 5, you're going with a man with the easiest first name to pronounce and the most challenging last name.
Are you going with Jalen or JT in that regard? I suppose either one is really suitable, but JT Tuimoloau, what he's been for Ohio State throughout his entire career, but then certainly when you look at the player he's been this season, he has been exceptional. And yes, you have the combination of he and Jack Sawyer up front, and all the ballyhoo that they came in with, they've returned for another season, and JT Tuimoloau has continued to showcase his abilities as a pass rusher, his strength as a run defender. It's why I see Ohio State as the top defense in the Big Ten Conference. And yes, they've got talent at every level on the back end, at linebacker, the athleticism all over the field. But when you're talking about playmakers that are in their defensive front, and which of those D linemen is at the top of every opposing scouting report for that offense, it is JT Tuimoloau because of everything he brings to the table, running, passing, everything that he can do as a defender is always on display.
Came in as a superstar prospect out of high school and has lived up to that hype for sure. Number 4, we're heading out to Nebraska for one of their big guys.
I see him as almost like an action figure, with Ty Robinson, because not only the size, but the strength. He's kind of like this tree trunk in the middle of their defense, this immovable object. But then when you get him into some of those predictable downs and distances, he's the main guy that allows Nebraska to earn the right to rush the quarterback on third down because of everything he does on first and second. And then when he sort of gets that stance elongated a little bit, gets some blood in his fingertips, explodes into the opposing backfield, you're almost caught off guard because of how big and thick he is. But he's very mobile, and he's got the ability to get skinny into gaps, and there is so much violence in the hands of Ty Robinson that he is constantly getting home and imposing his will in the opposing backfield.
Why is Jordan Birch of Oregon at number 3?
Now, you could make the case he'd be even higher. Now, he's missed a couple of games this season, has 6 sacks on the year despite missing a couple of games, but in what also is a really deep defensive front for the Oregon Ducks. He's the player that can be that movable chess piece. He can be on the left edge, the right edge, interior, over either guard, and he's athletic and mobile enough to direct shot at any position the Ducks put him at. So we're talking about the opposing scouting report. Jordan Birch is definitely that guy who tops it for every opponent, and you see the energy, the way that he's ramped up season by season, the style of play he's come into his own.
You mentioned scouting reports. The NFL has been compiling a scouting report on the next guy. At number 2, you've got Michigan's Mason Graham.
And the defensive front for Michigan, we saw the test that they posed for Indiana's offense. And it's not only the power that he has on the interior, but that energy that he plays with. He flies all over the field. We see him slinging bodies of interior offensive linemen left and right. He's got a toolbox that is unrivaled for interior defensive linemen with the way he can rush the quarterback and how difficult it is to be able to contain him on the interior to the A gap, to the B gap. You want to talk violence of hands. You want to talk burst and close into blockers. Mason Graham is a constant barrage of moves on the inside.
And we end our segment the way we started it. Your number 1 defensive lineman, an Indiana Hoosier.
A guy who is new to Big Ten football, but certainly announced his presence with all the authority imaginable, Mikal Kamara. I just told you last week, he's my front runner for the Hendricks Award for the best defensive end in college football this season. And everything he's done this year showcases why. The way he can rush the quarterback, the flat back he turns the corner with, the way he can get that upfield toe turn to keep his cleats in the ground and then close to burst and finish at the quarterback. He has been the Mariano Rivera of the Big Ten Conference this season. When Indiana has a lead, when they're trying to close the show in the fourth quarter, Mikal Kamara is the guy who gets that done, making sure that that opposing offense has no life, that they can breathe back into their efforts.
Ross, you got about 30 seconds to tell Anthony where he was wrong.
No, he was great. He's never wrong. He's always right, Mike, always. But I'll tell you this. I want to point out how wild it is that we're talking about an Indiana player as the top defensive lineman in the Big Ten. right? What an incredible season in Bloomington. I told you guys earlier, I was just there yesterday, visited with a couple, actually, of their players, including their linebacker that was featured there with Jerry and Urban, Aiden Fisher. And, man, they are hyped up. They're ready to go. They do the little things well, right? They're incredibly well coached and do the little things well. So it's pretty remarkable, right, that we're talking about an Indiana Hoosier as the top D lineman and maybe the top defense.
And what you were saying, too, he went from James Madison last year to maybe the NFL next year, the way he's going.
Oh, yeah, that's an NFL player right there. When you can rush the quarterback like that, he will be at the next level.
That's an incredible, one of the many great stories coming out of Bloomington. For Ross and Anthony and Kyle and I'm Mike. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.